Blimey, those lights are bright, aren't they? Actually, it's quite useful because I get really nervous in front of crowds, so I can't see any of you, so this is great. So I always have a problem speaking at men's rights events because most of the time I'm not at men's rights events when I have to defend men's rights activism. I have to explain, look, there's a very, very strong, what we could generously term a women's rights lobby that is dominating Western countries, and no one speaks on behalf of men. So I often have to make the argument, but it's totally redundant in a room full of people who completely understand it way better than I do. So instead, I found a video from Vice magazine India that I thought I'd cover because this is something that it was like poetry. How the phenomenal self-own of Vice magazine. I really wanted to share it with you because it was something that really made my afternoon. So the video is called "Inside the Growing Men's Rights Movement in India." Dun, dun, dun. And the description reads as follows. In the early 2000s, India started a push towards gender equality with new laws aimed at protecting women from assault and marital disputes. But as protections for women grow stronger, some men in the country have started to mobilize, convinced women make false accusations and use laws against their husbands as retribution. Now note the language here, right? Some men, but all women. It's not what they say either. They're obviously very, very sensible with their activism. They're exactly like you chaps, in fact. They begin with a fellow saying, and they begin at a men's rights conference in India, and it looks just like this one. And they start with a fellow saying, well, they believe that crime is only associated with men, and nobody is talking about men's issues, which sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? And then begins the narrator, who happens to be a male feminist. And it's weird hearing male feminist rhetoric in an Indian accent, I've just got to say. There's nothing wrong with it, it's just really weird. Actually, what I'm saying, there is a lot wrong with male feminist activism. The narrator begins like this. In the US, the men's rights movement is largely contained within online fringe hate groups. I mean, that's just amazing, isn't it? It's like, here's a well, here is a bucket of poison. Like, that's the worst intro to anything I've ever heard. But naturally, the presenter blames this on the patriarchy. Specifically, dowry laws, which in fact were antiquated at the time when they were outlawed in 1961. So how this is a problem, I don't know. But the main contention he makes, and this is the reason that men's rights activism is illegitimate. Every year, thousands of women are murdered in dowry disputes. Because despite it being illegal, it still happens. This is cultural tradition. Now, I agree that that's terrible. No one deserves to be murdered, obviously. But how is it that crimes that happen to a very, very small percentage of women justify creating laws that put all men at risk of false allegations? This is totally unjust. But anyway, contradicting the description, the narrator says that the Indian men's rights movement sort of gained traction in the 1980s as a response to these anti-dowry laws. But the footage on the screen tells a different tale, because they're playing footage of men's rights protests. And man, these are really hard to disagree with. I mean, the banners that you're seeing say things like, "Husbands are not free ATM machines, end alimony." So, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Because this is a really just cause that they're arguing for, because the feminists are arguing for the emancipation of women from men. They want women to be able to earn their own money, earn their own property, and live their own lives as independent human beings. That's fine. Everyone agrees with that. But the converse of that is that men have to be emancipated from women. If women choose to make certain life decisions, there's no reason that the men should pay for them. And that's a perfectly fair contention. The narrator then says that within the last few years, the Indian MRA has gained huge traction because of a surge of anti-rape legislation. And again, these are really familiar stories because these men are claiming that they are the target of false allegations. And I was watching this thinking of David Silverman. If any of you don't know who David Silverman is, he was the president of the American Atheist Association. He was a male feminist, and he did everything he could to promote feminism. And then the false allegations came from women he had had consensual affairs with. The allegations themselves were transparent, in fact, paper thin, and anyone who was in any way familiar with this organization and this community could tell that this was malevolent. And in the case of David Silverman, it took these false allegations to absolutely ruin his social standing before he would then come and speak to me in an interview on my channel and say, okay, I admit, you were right about all of this. You know, you were right, we shouldn't have left the gate open to malicious actors who can level those false allegations and have no recourse, and the man being alleged can have no recourse against it. And then we're introduced to a regular-looking Indian man who tells us that his wife had filed false claims about some really quite arcane Indian laws on the subject, including dowry harassment and unnatural sex. Now, I don't have any commentary on the Indian laws, but these are things that he denies, and the evidence is purely on the strength of her testimony. Because, I mean, what evidence are they going to provide? This chap had levelled a complaint against her first, however, with the authorities, because the complaint was that his wife had sent their daughter away to live with her parents, and he was being denied access to them. So, like a regular person would do, he went to the police. And the police went through the procedures with him and found that, yeah, it was unfair that he was being denied access to seeing his own daughter, and returned his daughter to them. And that's when the allegations began from the wife. In his words, he calls it an act of revenge. And it's hard to say that it doesn't look like that. At the time of recording, he hadn't seen his own daughter in over a year, because his wife had left him before making these allegations, taking the daughter with him, leaving him with no other recourse. The worst part, though, and again, this is why I juxtapose this with the issue of David Silverman, is because this man had been a feminist activist. He had actively protested for this state of affairs until it had come full circle and he'd become the victim of it. Then we're introduced to Anil Kumar, who's the founder of the Save the Indian Family Foundation. A few people, I believe, are here tonight. Vice magazine smear him with the worst they can do. They say, he takes his cue from A Voice for Men. They have published anti-feminist material. Oh. Well, if I'd known they were going to say something about feminism, I wouldn't have come, but... But they have an interview with Anil, and it's a really reasonable interview. Even the most damning extract is the least damning thing you can imagine. Anil is just straightforwardly says he helps men who are suffering from domestic violence, false allegations, or are being abused in the family courts. What can you object to? What could you put? Yeah, exactly. Big deal, you know. In fact, this guy looks like he's doing a damn fine job. The host then complains about the fringe of men's rights activists who, quote, want to put women back in the kitchen. Now, he never shows any of them, and I've actually yet to meet any of these people, but this is something that we're told of. But of course, the male feminist doesn't ever substantiate this at all, and instead defaults to feminist rhetoric. Well, don't you realize that men are more powerful than women? As if he is ignoring directly, when in the documentary, the mini documentary itself, he is ignoring the people who can't even see their own children and claiming that they are the powerful ones in the situation. It's like, well, come on, if they had power, they would surely not be in this position. He is actively ignoring the evidence of his own eyes and defaulting to feminist ideological rhetoric. Power indeed. So we learn that when it comes to accusations of rape, the men are automatically guilty. Again, this is all sounding very familiar, isn't it? And he describes the host describes the gathering, he describes it as an AA meeting of aggrieved husbands. It's like, so what? Like the atmosphere of this mini documentary is that these are evil men. It's like, no, these are men who have had an injustice done to them. The SIF meeting is run by a lawyer who gives free legal advice to these men, and the host objects to the lawyer explaining that there are 40 or more laws that are created regarding women and none created regarding men. And his objection, his objection is that this is because there are per capita, women face more potential violence than men. It's like, well, let's just assume they did. That doesn't justify any of this. Then they have a cutaway, and it shows the levels of violence against women in India. They have nice bar graphs that come up. Oh, look, 300,000 women have got, various different, types of violence done against them. But it doesn't show the statistics against men, which plays into Anil's point that you're only looking at one side of the coin. In their own documentary, they deliberately only look at the same side of the coin. And again, even if this is true, how does it justify creating laws that enable false allegations to be leveled? The framing is of a gender war from the male feminist, as if it's justified for women to take revenge in the abstract. The women as a group are justified in doing this to men as a group because of individual grievances. The host then meets with a Supreme Court lawyer and feminist called Karuna Nundy. Now, I'd never heard of this woman before, but man, did she piss me off. She unironically said, "Men have a pervasive sense of victimhood." That was at least original. Like, I'd not heard a feminist in the West say that.
She's from Cambridge.
She sounded awful, and she sounded exactly that kind. And she thinks that this sense of victimhood comes from a misunderstanding about feminism. Oh. Well, I mean, we've got literally dozens of examples in a room where she could just ask them, why are you here? But she doesn't. She's figured it out. She doesn't need your opinion. She thinks that they view it as women against men rather than people against patriarchy. Which is wonderful because we've defined men outside of people now. This is like, if you're a man, you're pro-patriarchy, and you're outside of the group that is people. So congratulations for being actually unpersoned by a female feminist lawyer in India. She dismisses the pro-woman, anti-male laws as just a widespread myth. But you can't help but notice that she's speaking from a really privileged position, and she looks it. She's very prim and proper, in fact, Cambridge bred, as you can tell, and she's obviously in control. She's the one talking down to these poor men who are having their lives ruined. And she can't be put in their position. It is a demonstrable privilege. She can't have a false allegation made against her because of their law is the same as our law. She just can't be the recipient of that. So she is speaking from an immunity to this thing and telling them, just deal with it. It's not your problem. You've got this wrong. I know, even though I am immune to this and can never be affected by it. She then says that the burden of proof is on the prosecution, so it's fine. But the proof is the allegation itself. So how is that fair? And then she goes on to distinguish how there are false positives and false negatives, and claims that the false negatives affect women far greater than the false positives are affecting men. The false positive being false allegations of rape, and the false negatives being women who have been raped and are not being helped. But she does agree that we do have to address the misuse of these laws, which give false positives, which is what those men's rights activists are trying to do. That's precisely why they're there. However, she does recognize, she doesn't say it explicitly, but implicitly, this is a recognition that she has a privileged status in the status quo, and she wants to keep it that way. We follow the gentleman from the beginning who goes to the police station as the host does a piece to camera. This is the man who has his daughter stolen by his now ex-wife. And the host says, when I met him, I thought he'd be a proper MRA. You know, all women suck. Yikes. But the thing is, even he's forced to admit that this is just a guy. It's just some guy who's down on his luck. And he's in trouble, not of his own making, and he's doing what he can to get his daughter back. And you can see it pierce through the ideology very briefly, because this guy is genuinely sympathetic. He's had his life ruined, and it's not his fault. He was the first person to go to the police and say, look, I'm being aggrieved. I can't see my daughter, and now the cavalcade of allegations have come. And he says that the only people helping him are the Save the Indian Family Foundation. No one else will come to his defense. Luckily, in this chap's case, he was actually released, but at the time of the documentary recording, he was due for a court appearance, so I don't know how it went. But we cut back to Anil explaining that the feminists have had many victories in what appears to be the feminist war on men, but they have no grace in victory. And that's a really fascinating point that I think that we really should emphasize more in our own discussion about the thing. They are winning victories, they are getting laws changed, and they are actually having an effect on men, which is what this absolute room full of people demonstrates. But they don't stop when they've won. You know, normally when you punch a man and you've got him down, you stop punching him. But they won't do it. They're still going. I compare this with David Silverman because it's exactly the same pattern. One that we all recognize, we all know, and is well documented. And if you're a male feminist watching this, it's only a matter of time, man. Feminists genuinely do view this as a war on men. I mean, what is the patriarchy, if not the world order that has been created by men? What is it, if it's not that? Who promotes it, if not men themselves, unconsciously, unthinkingly? They are, in fact, pro-woman rather than pro-victim. They don't believe that men can be victims, and they don't believe that women can be victimizers. And there are a million stories, a million examples that can demonstrate the opposite. But this is why I come and speak at men's rights conferences, because I don't consider myself necessarily to be a men's rights activist. I'm a human rights activist. But men's rights are human rights. And this is genuinely the difference between feminists and men's rights activists. Feminism is ideological. They are speaking in the abstract. They can be speaking to victims. Someone who is directly a victim of a woman using the court system and saying, no, you're not actually the victim, you're actually the oppressor. It's utterly backwards. Whereas the men's rights movement is empirical. You are looking at the evidence and saying, well, this is proof that there is a problem. Because it is. This is why I'm happy to call myself a women's rights advocate, but I would never, ever call myself a feminist. Thank you very much.
So what is